Joining us now from Tel Aviv is the former Israeli Prime Minister, the current chairman of the opposition Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Prime Minister, thanks very much for coming in. Why not immediately cease the operation, given the humanitarian crisis that has developed inside Gaza?
This humanitarian crisis is a direct result of the Hamas tactic of firing at our civilians and hiding behind their civilians. And it's something that we cannot tolerate. No nation would tolerate 6,000 rockets fired on its cities. And Israel finally decided to take action. We have to make sure that we don't just have a ceasefire, but that this criminal rocketing of our cities is not resumed a few months from now. Because that's exactly what happened a few months ago. They were firing rockets at us, the Hamas. We had a ceasefire. They used the ceasefire to get further range, longer range rockets, which they've now fired at Beersheba and Ashdod and into the southern suburbs of Tel Aviv. So obviously we have to remove the threat, not just stop the firing. And that's what Israel is engaged in right now.
You're a former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. I want you to listen to what the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, said on Wednesday. This is several days ago. Listen to this.
I wish to underline in the strongest possible terms the world's call for an immediate ceasefire that is fully respected by all parties. This must be achieved now. The parties must step back from the brink. All this violence must end.
Certainly seems to be a lot of international pressure emerging on the government of Israel to accept a ceasefire. How does the Israeli government deal with this? And I know you speak as the opposition leader.
Well, there is no opposition and coalition, and there's no politics right now. We're united as a people to roll back this enormous terror threat to our people. Remember that 1 million people, that's roughly equivalent to 45 million Americans, are under rocket fire in our major cities. So that's something we can't tolerate. No nation would tolerate it. You imagine that you now would hear an air raid siren from where you are. I think you're in Washington. Is that right, Wolf?
Yes.
Are you in Washington right now?
Yes.
All right. Now imagine that you hear a siren, a missile warning siren. You have 30 seconds to get into an air raid shelter. And that happens hourly, day after day, month after month, year after year. Obviously, that has to be stopped. And what we want to make sure is that it's not resumed again. So Israel is using the means available to it, not the means, a fraction of the means available to it. If we just wanted to hit civilians, we'd carpet bomb Gaza. This is not something that we even imagine doing. We sent in our soldiers today and risked their lives, in fact, lost Israeli lives today, the lives of our boys, because we're trying to ferret out the terrorists. If we just wanted to act from the air, we could have done what Britain did in World War II when thousands of rockets were fired on its cities. And, you know, it leveled Dresden and a few other places in Germany. I'm not criticizing Britain for that. The circumstances were such that it probably had to act in that fashion. But we are not acting in that fashion. We are doing what we can to pinpoint, surgically strike the terrorists. And sometimes there are incidental civilian casualties. But the burden of responsibility is on Hamas, and the way to stop this is to ensure that Hamas doesn't have the capability to resume fire within a very short time.
There have been some who've suggested, Mr. Prime Minister, that Israel's goal right now is to destroy Hamas, to remove Hamas from its control of Gaza and allow the Palestinian Authority of the President Mahmoud Abbas to reemerge as the authority in Gaza. Is that your understanding?
Well, my understanding is that the desire is to stop the fighting and remove the threat. Does removing the threat require removing the Hamas regime? Ultimately, probably the answer is yes, for the simple reason that you have to ask, why is Hamas firing these rockets in the first place? After all, we left every square inch of Gaza. And they're quite explicit, and may I say quite honest about it, quite direct. They say, look, we're firing these rockets to liberate occupied Palestine, occupied Ashkelon, occupied Ashdod, occupied Tel Aviv. To them, any place that Israel sits on, any square inch of Israel is occupied territory, and Israel has to be destroyed. So obviously, if you have such a militant Islamic base under the control and inspiration of Iran a few minutes from Tel Aviv, obviously, ultimately, I think we'll have to remove that base. Whether or not that is the goal of that current operation, well, you'd have to ask the government that.
Some have suggested, Mr. Prime Minister, that what's happening in Gaza right now is similar to what Israel did in Lebanon in 2006 when it went after Hezbollah, which was launching rockets and mortars into northern Israel. But Hezbollah emerged from that conflict 30 days or so in what arguably is even a stronger political situation than it was before. It's now part of the Lebanese government. How worried are you that Hamas might emerge politically stronger as a result of what's going on right now in Gaza?
Well, I think that's a real concern, that we want to make sure that there's no question as to the defeat of Hamas, that such tactics of firing on civilians and hiding behind civilians that Hamas is employing, which is, by the way, a double war crime according to the international law. We have to ensure that they are not rewarded for this, that they're severely punished for this. And I think this is Israel's concern right now. Otherwise, they would gain politically. But remember that Gaza is different.
Looks like, unfortunately, we just lost our satellite with Tel Aviv. We'll try to get that up and continue this conversation. Actually, I think we're back. Is Mr. Prime Minister, you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, go ahead and finish your thought on how you're hoping that this operation in Gaza vis-a-vis Hamas will end differently than what Israel tried to do in 2006 against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Well, I think we have to be more decisive and to learn the lessons of not being decisive in Lebanon. Second, unlike Lebanon, Gaza is an isolated arena. There is no supply line from which Iran and Syria can continually supply the Hamas. They've supplied them up to this current crisis, but the supply routes are blocked off. So I think that it's possible to give here a decisive blow to Hamas. And I want to emphasize that I'm talking, and the government is talking about Hamas, its fighters, its command hierarchy, but not the civilians. Regrettably, Hamas doesn't care about Palestinian civilians. It doesn't really care for them any more than it cares for Israeli civilians. And so they hide inside the populated areas seeking immunity. A responsible government doesn't let terrorists get away with it. They ferret out the terrorists that are embedded in the civilian population. They seek to minimize civilian casualties, sometimes at the expense of our own casualties, of our own troops. But under no circumstances do we give the terrorists immunity. That would be an enormous victory for terrorism, and they'll just repeat this tactic again and again, and not only against us.